どうした？それでも世界で最も邪悪な一族の末裔か
7, 6, 11, 5, 9 and 20 miles today, 4,
28
11,
years
17,
alone.
32 the day before.
What does that do to you? We can never know for sure. You might think someone left alone in the apocalypse for this long would be consumed, either literally by a monster or mentally consumed by the evil that surrounds them. Dr. Kelson was certainly changed by the unimaginable amount of death that surrounded him. He is independent and proves he can survive this world on his own. But Kelson was also plagued with loneliness, something he needed a cure for, and something the apocalypse may have presented right in front of him.
Rise, to think of something different. Oh, God, keep me from going lunatic. Moving up and down again. That's all the stars in the world.
In today's video, we'll be diving into the post-apocalyptic genre to see what would it take to survive this long, or rather, is mere survival even enough?
7, 6, 11, 5, 4, 17, 32 the day before.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
While Night of the Living Dead may not be the first depiction of zombies, it effectively birthed and popularized this type of story. And after watching this film, there is a glaring difference between it and the modern zombie films it birthed, and it has to do with why the apocalypse starts and our evolving relationship with the start of the apocalypse. In 1968, when the film released, the concept of a zombie virus spreading almost instantaneously like this was new. The film leaves the cause of the outbreak largely a mystery and leaves you as the viewer to try to discover the cause, just like the characters of the film try to when they listen in on the radio broadcast throughout. In the context of modern apocalyptic films, you see the start of the apocalypse evolve to reflect modern issues and fears. The film 28 Days Later cold opens with a sequence of how the apocalypse started. This sequence is separate from the narrative and characters of the rest of the film. Essentially, a group of animal rights activists recklessly disrupt experiments on a chimp that has the quote rage virus, eventually infecting them all and leading to a countrywide outbreak.
The animals are contagious. The infection is in their blood and saliva. One bite. Stop!
The scientists presumably recklessly engineered this virus, and the protesters recklessly ignored the warnings from the scientists. This immediately creates a sense of tension and mistrust between the government and authority with the common person. The characters in the scene never return, but it is crucial in establishing a human responsibility compared to the largely vague and accidental outbreak presented in Night of the Living Dead. The differences in the foundation of the apocalypse in both of these films offer different outlooks on survival for the characters. Because of the vague and largely unknown cause of the apocalypse in Night of the Living Dead, it forces the characters to focus purely on immediate survival. The protagonist Ben is ultimately left as the only survivor out of the main cast, but his efforts towards survival are suddenly recontextualized in the very end when an armed posse arrives. They are seen killing the remaining zombies and then mistake Ben for one of them and kill him, putting his body amongst the other zombies. He survives for the entire film just to be killed by something other than the main apocalyptic threat presented. This is the foundation of a really important idea for this genre when the threat of other people is greater than the threat of the apocalypse. 28 Days Later sets up its world and story to take a different approach towards survival. They immediately establish the mistrust with authority, and the first scene with the main character, Jim, is a haunting few minutes of him wandering an empty London with no people in sight. Through these two scenes, it presents being alive in this world as hollow and lonely. And while the zombies in this movie are terrifying, the scariest thing for Jim is loneliness, and that is shown in the scene when he has a nightmare not about the murderous zombies, but simply waking up alone.
Hello! Hello! Hello!
So it establishes for the whole franchise this greater purpose than just living. It's what creates the conflict at the end of the film. Jim and the other survivors are saved by these soldiers who are reduced to simply just think about survival and reproduction. In the process, they lose their humanity and become villains for the protagonists. With the soldiers, Jim and the others would maybe be safer, but would be building a life that's not worth living. In modern post-apocalyptic films, I think we are seeing a visual shift, especially with color and the apocalyptic landscapes. A show like The Walking Dead is famously bleak and gray with fully abandoned cities, and with the recent release of The Last of Us adaptation, I think is the perfect representation of this shift. While the original game did come out at a similar time The Walking Dead was starting, I think the popularity of the new TV adaptation is setting the Green City as a defining characteristic of the genre. It's to a point where I think most apocalyptic media now are realizing nature in the apocalypse and having nature reclaiming our cities, which makes sense as climate change continues to become a more concerning and talked about issue. And then I started to notice it in other films. For example, Wall-E, commonly known as one of Pixar's most beautiful films, but that also happens to be set in a post-apocalyptic setting. Wall-E is interesting because it's far from a horror movie. It's a kids' movie. You wouldn't immediately think to group it with the other movies and shows that I've already discussed in this genre. But there are still people who are suffering in this film, but it's in a different way, slowly losing what makes them human and the ability to make their own decisions. This all brings me to the next film I want to discuss, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. It's the perfect example of beauty in the apocalypse. Nausicaa is Studio Ghibli's first film, released in 1984, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, who famously grounds his films in environmental themes. Nausicaa creates a really interesting apocalyptic setting because it takes place nearly 1,000 years after the apocalypse. It leaves how it started pretty ambiguous, and for the characters, it is framed almost as legend or religious. They talk about the 7 days of fire which brought upon the end of the world, and they picture these giant titans, which were presumably human-engineered bioweapons, but are pictured through the eyes of the characters as hellish titans. The 7 days of fire resulted in the spread of the toxic jungle, the home of giant, horrifying insects called ohms. Throughout, there are 3 warring factions focused on surviving and defeating the spread of the toxic jungle, all culminating in a scene where one of the factions uses the very weapon that ended the world to massacre the ohms. The messaging of the film begins straight away when Nausicaa is first exploring the toxic jungle. There is imagery of death throughout, but ultimately becomes quite beautiful, ending with Nausicaa basking in the toxins in an ohm shell. The idea of there being beauty in the toxic jungle is developed throughout, with Nausicaa ultimately discovering that the toxic jungle is actually purifying the earth underneath from the damage caused by humans 1,000 years ago. But throughout all this time, we continue to still disrupt nature and the natural purification of earth. What I think the film is trying to say is that the world around us is naturally healing, but the problem lies within humanity disrupting that through things like war to satisfy a lust for power or safety from what we don't understand. And Miyazaki displays this through a character like Nausicaa, who chooses to understand and see the beauty in things like the toxic jungle and the giant ohms. In the end, the goal was never to survive the toxic jungle. They had been doing that for 1,000 years, and it wasn't enough. Miyazaki presents something different, the idea of finding meaning, understanding, and beauty in the world that surrounds us, even amongst the evil, war, and decay. Nausicaa is one of my favorite post-apocalyptic films, which is partly why I just yapped about it for so long. But now think about your favorite films from this genre. What makes the world it builds so appealing? What made a show like The Walking Dead such a cultural phenomenon that still sees spin offs to this day? What I think makes the apocalypse so appealing to us is two things: simplicity and purpose. Let's go back to the moments from way back in season 1 of The Walking Dead when we see the main cast of characters adjusting to their new life in the zombie apocalypse. At the end of episode 3, we see Shane teaching Carl to fish, and Andrea, Carol, and some others washing clothes by hand by the lake. Carl is having fun trying to fish with a net, not worried about being unsuccessful. The women are reminiscing over having washers, dryers, and other technology while still enjoying and appreciating the return to simplicity of the tasks they are doing. Compared to how we lived hundreds of years ago, real life now is like living on easy mode. But life continues to add on complexities, new technologies, and the pressure to reach more ambitious goals, and it never lets up. That's why we romanticize the apocalypse. We crave the return to simplicity and the more defined sense of purpose. The life we fantasize in a post-apocalyptic world is a life without gray areas. You are either alive or dead. There's two options. A clear sense of purpose. So while the women in The Walking Dead missed their luxuries from the old world, the apocalypse allowed them to escape to simpler times. An escape for Carol away from her abusive husband, and a clear purpose of survival that allowed her to grow into a more independent woman able to break away from him. And 28 days later, we saw loneliness be the source of horror for Jim. 28 years later, we are introduced to new characters who seem mostly safe from the rage virus. They live on an island that acts as a sanctuary, completely untouched by the infected for years. But yet again, it's not enough. I asked myself throughout the film, what could they possibly be gaining that makes it worth it to leave their island sanctuary to the mainland? Why train a kid to go to the infected land? It isn't until Spike's decision at the end of the film that contextualizes it all for me. Throughout the film, he was constantly warned about the dangers of the mainland and how anyone left alive there is most certainly psychotic and evil. And this is especially true when his father refers to Dr. Kelson. He's also told that there is nothing that can be done about his mother's illness that is slowly turning her insane. He takes matters into his own hands when he escapes to the mainland seeking out Dr. Kelson, the only hope for his mother's survival. Kelson ends up being nothing like he was told about. He's calm, he's understanding, and he cares deeply for those who are infected, memorializing them in a bone temple made from the dead's bones. Kelson explains to Spike how his mom has cancer, and the best thing they can do for her is to assist her death and memorialize her in the bone temple. Kelson widened Spike's perspective beyond what he could know from the island where he was born. Spike has already experienced survival, lived through the threat of the infected and the threat of death, but as he transitions into adulthood, he hasn't found meaning. And he won't find it on the island. He is in search of something greater, something he can only find on the mainland. And even though the mainland is far more dangerous, it represents something much more valuable: possibility and purpose. Spike wouldn't have come to terms with his mom's death without Kelson contextualizing memento mori for him. It's an answer he could have only found on the mainland. That's why you see people leave the safety of the island. That's why Spike chose not to return. The possibility of finding a greater purpose is far more important than simply just surviving. And that finally leads us back to the Bone Temple, the latest film in the franchise. Kelson survived largely alone for 28 years. You can only imagine how that level of loneliness can affect someone. But his time with Spike also pushed him towards something greater. He began tranquilizing one of the infected he named Samson. Samson is an alpha, one of the smartest and strongest of the infected. By tranquilizing Samson, it allowed him to interact closely with the infected and honestly share some quite beautiful and peaceful moments with them. This film offers the most intriguing answer to survival not being enough. It's being able to find humanity in the direct source of the horror and apocalypse. Kelson was the only one who saw the zombies as people who are dying, but also as people that can be saved, patients that can be cured. The ending of the film flips the script, having Jimmy, a human, being the antagonist and the source of evil, while having Samson, the zombie, be the one to care for the dying Kelson, acknowledging him by name, proving Kelson was able to reach Samson and bring back his humanity, curing him. Through having Kelson die, giving up his survival, which he has been committed to for 28 years, it reveals his commitment to saving Spike from going down an evil path and his commitment to curing the dead. Even for a man who became so comfortable with surviving, it was still more important for him to work towards restoring humanity once again. Survival doesn't last long, and what our post-apocalyptic media shows is that there's always another threat, and eventually the threat of the apocalypse always takes a backseat to the threat of ourselves. Think to yourself, why are the zombies in The Walking Dead so slow? It's because they are not the real threat. The real threats are Shane, a friend who descends into jealousy and violence, the governor, who presents himself as a savior but is threatened by the presence of another large group, and Negan, who justifies violence as a necessity for order. And after the last fades away, another takes its place. It's never enough. You're never safe. There's always more work to do. That's why you can't just survive. We need to find community and work towards some greater purpose in order to stay sane and truly live. And to truly live sometimes means sacrificing mere survival. We write the post-apocalyptic characters we watch to reflect us, and just like them, we strongly desire a return to simpler times with a community of support and a more clear purpose.